Let's talk about some different techniques while you're sewing. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are going to be talking about alternatives to techniques while you're sewing. So, when you are sewing, there's actually not normally one right or wrong way to do things, there's a couple different options. And as an example, let's take finishing off the edges of fabric. So, as you can see here, I have some fabric that the edges are not finished off of, and when you're sewing, a lot of times you are going to want to make sure those are nice and finished. Normally, your pattern that you are using may say somewhere if they have a preferred method. Sometimes the patterns will say they want you to do French seams or just finish off the edges so that you're not worried about them fraying or unraveling over time. So when you have a pattern that does that, if it tells you exactly how to do it, that's really helpful. But other times there are alternatives such as using a serger, using an overcast stitch, using a zigzag stitch, pinking shears, lots of different ways you can do it. So on mine, I'm using a serger. Now, another alternative when it comes to sewing can be a lot of the time for clasps or finishings or closures. So as an example with this shirt, it has like a little loop that then you put a button through. So I have started the process here, but sometimes this can be really difficult for people, and instead maybe you want to use something like an elastic cord that kind of loops around instead of having to do this really narrow fabric loop. In addition, maybe you want to use a hook and eye closure. So when you are looking at different patterns, when you're looking at how they have their closures set up, remember there's not necessarily one right or wrong way. A lot of the times these closures are really just used more as like a decorative touch. So if you want to switch that up to have it be more consistent with your own style, you could definitely do that. So here's what my closure looks like so far. I do have it started out and then I was able to sew it into my shirt, but you could always do a different technique. Now, as you can see here, as I'm putting it onto my shirt, I've actually used quilting clips and pins. So this is another example of like alternatives with sewing, because while both of these are holding my fabric in place, the pin is a little bit more exact, and that quilting clip can hold multiple layers of fabric together. It can be great for quilting, but the quilting clips aren't always great for really thin or slippery fabrics. So when you are sewing, definitely be sure to figure out which one do you like to work with the best. I keep both on hand since they both serve slightly different purposes. And as you can see in this case, both of them worked to get this little closure on, so great options either way. Now, another alternative when it comes to sewing is a hem. So this is the bottom of a shirt that I'm working on, and in the pattern, normally it will say how they want you to hem it. So in this case, they want you to fold it over a quarter of an inch and then press it out and then fold it over again. So doing a rolled hem in a way, but there's a lot of different ways you can do rolled hems. And the biggest thing to always remember when you are going to do any sort of rolled hem, if you want to do it your own way, is just be sure that you're taking care and noting the measurements for how big of a hem it's supposed to be. So if it is a 1-inch hem, being sure that you're not going greater than that 1-inch hem unless the sizing is better for you. Hems really offer a lot of freedom, so if you wanted to make this shirt shorter, you could definitely do that to make it more cropped. If you wanted to keep it at more longer, maybe you shorten the hem ever so slightly. As you can see here, I have done a rolled hem for this shirt. I could have also done it a little differently where I actually did 2 seams. So one being an 1/8 of an inch seam that I'm sewing all the way around, and then folding that over again and sewing the 1/8 of an inch seam a second time. Lots of different ways you can do hems. There's not really a right or wrong way, and depending on the pattern you use, you'll actually see that they offer different suggestions of how to do a hem. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is definitely collars and finishing off the edges around a collar, and that's because it can really vary depending on the pattern you're using. So in this pattern, I'm going to be using bias tape. So bias tape is a great way to finish off any of the edges. It's used a lot for armholes as well, but there's different ways you could do it. For example, you could have added a full lining to this where we're almost making a repeat copy of the outside of the shirt and just pushing it inside so that you get a lined effect. You could also have done like a facing, so maybe it's only the top portion, or you could do bias tape like this. And I think all of these alternatives is what makes sewing so fun, because there's not really one right or wrong way to do something, especially if you start seeing how other people sew and you start learning from teachers. You'll see that everybody has their own little techniques. Now, my big sort of caveat to that is to remember what is the function of whatever you're trying to do. So when you are looking at different techniques, if the function or what you're trying to do is going to change. And so for example, you decide to do a button closure instead of a hook and eye, that is going to affect how your fabric lays. So always take that into account when you're trying out new ideas or when you want to try something slightly different than what the pattern is recommending you do. I hope this gave you some ideas and let you see that sewing is very creative and flexible. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.